She woke up every morning believing she had finally found the one. After years of loneliness, failed relationships, and sleepless nights wondering if real love even existed anymore, Rebecca thought her prayers had been answered. He was everything she'd dreamed of: attentive, caring, present. But on one ordinary Tuesday night in their quiet Florida home, something slipped. Not just a piece of clothing or a careless word, but something that revealed a truth so devastating, so incomprehensible, that in a matter of seconds, her entire world collapsed. What happened in that bedroom wasn't just shocking, it was brutal. And the question that haunted investigators, neighbors, and eventually the entire nation was this: how could she not have known? How could someone live with another person, share a bed, share a life, and never see the monster hiding beneath the surface? Stay with me until the end, because the truth behind this case will leave you questioning everything you know about love, trust, and the lies people tell to survive. Welcome to Silent Witness True Crime Stories. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe, and also download your free ebook by clicking the link in the pinned comment. This is a story about deception, but not the kind you see coming. Not the kind where there are obvious signs, glaring red flags, moments where you can say, "I should have known." This was different. This was a man who constructed an entire identity from nothing. A man who fooled not just one woman, but potentially dozens. A man whose lies were so carefully crafted that even trained investigators struggled to uncover the truth. So ask yourself these questions as we go deeper into this case. Who was this man really? What was he hiding that was worth building an entire fake life to protect? How did Rebecca, a smart, cautious woman who had been burned before, fall so completely under his spell? And most importantly, what happened in that bedroom that pushed her past the point of no return? What could make someone snap so violently that neighbors would later describe the screams as something they'd never forget? Keep those questions in mind, because the answers are far more disturbing than you might imagine. Rebecca Mitchell was 52 years old when she met him. She lived in a small town just outside Tampa, Florida, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where Sunday church services were followed by potluck dinners, where neighbors waved from their porches, and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. She'd been divorced for 6 years. Her ex-husband had left her for a younger woman, a cliché that hurt more than she ever admitted out loud. For a long time, Rebecca convinced herself she was fine alone. She had her job at the local library, her book club, her sister who lived 2 streets over. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the loneliness crept in like a cold draft, she couldn't help but wonder if she'd ever feel that spark again. Then she met David. At least, that's what he called himself, David Crawford. They met at a charity event at the community center, one of those fundraisers for the fire department where people bid on baked goods and homemade crafts. Rebecca had donated a quilt she'd spent 3 months making. David bought it for $200, far more than anyone expected. He approached her afterward, smiling, holding the quilt like it was a treasure. He told her it reminded him of one his grandmother used to have, that it made him feel at home. Rebecca felt something stir in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. He was handsome in an understated way, tall with graying hair and kind eyes. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, nothing flashy. He didn't try too hard. That's what she liked about him. He seemed genuine. Over the next few weeks, David pursued her gently. He'd show up at the library with coffee, always remembering how she liked it: 2 sugars, no cream. He'd invite her to walk along the riverfront in the evenings, where they'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. He told her he was a contractor, that he'd moved to Florida a year ago to start fresh after his wife passed away from cancer. He said he had no kids, no family left, that he was just trying to rebuild his life one day at a time. Rebecca's heart ached for him. She saw herself in his story, the loneliness, the longing for connection. They started dating officially after a month. He was attentive but never overbearing. He'd text her good morning every day, but he never demanded to know where she was or who she was with. He respected her space, her independence. Her sister loved him. Her friends at church thought he was a blessing. Even her ex-husband, who she ran into at the grocery store one day, remarked that she seemed happier. And she was. For the first time in years, Rebecca felt like she was living again, not just surviving. 6 months into the relationship, David suggested they move in together. Rebecca hesitated at first. It felt fast, but he was patient, understanding. He told her there was no rush, that he just wanted to be close to her, to build a life together. Eventually, she agreed. He moved into her house, a cozy 3-bedroom with a front porch and a garden she tended every weekend. Neighbors saw them together constantly. They'd grill out on Friday nights, host game nights with friends, take long drives to the beach on Sundays. To everyone watching, they were the perfect couple. But there were small things, little moments that didn't quite add up. David never wanted to go swimming, even in the Florida heat. He'd make excuses, say he had a skin condition, that the sun bothered him. He was oddly private about his body. He'd change in the bathroom with the door locked, even after months of living together. He never undressed in front of her, not fully. In bed, he'd keep the lights off, preferring darkness. Rebecca noticed, but she didn't push. She figured everyone had insecurities. Maybe he was self-conscious about scars, about aging. She didn't want to make him uncomfortable, but deep down, a tiny voice whispered that something wasn't right. It was a Tuesday night in late September. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that made your clothes stick to your skin. Rebecca had spent the day at work, her mind wandering to the dinner she planned to make that evening. She wanted it to be special. They'd been together for over a year now, and she'd been thinking about their future, about marriage, about growing old together. She stopped by the store on her way home, picking up ingredients for his favorite meal, shrimp scampi with garlic bread. She even bought candles, wanting to set a romantic mood. When David got home, he seemed tired. He told her he'd been working on a big project, that his back was sore. But he smiled when he saw the table, the candles flickering, the smell of garlic and butter filling the small dining room. They ate slowly, talking about their day, laughing at something silly one of her co-workers had said. After dinner, they moved to the couch. Rebecca poured them each a glass of wine. The conversation turned softer, more intimate. She leaned into him, feeling safe, feeling loved. She suggested they go to the bedroom. David hesitated. He said he was tired, that maybe they could just watch a movie instead. But Rebecca persisted gently. She wanted to feel close to him. She needed that connection. Eventually, he agreed. In the bedroom, Rebecca lit more candles. The room glowed softly. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching as David moved toward the bathroom. He always did this, always changed in private. But tonight, something in her wouldn't let it go. She stood up, walked over to him before he could close the door. She reached for his shirt, playful, affectionate. He pulled back. His face changed. There was a flash of something she'd never seen before. Panic, maybe even fear. She asked him what was wrong. He said nothing, that he just needed a minute. But Rebecca felt a knot forming in her stomach. She pressed him, gently at first, then more insistently. Why wouldn't he let her in? Why was he always so guarded? David's jaw tightened. He told her to drop it, but she couldn't. Not this time. She reached for his belt, not aggressively, but firmly. He tried to stop her, grabbing her wrist. They stood there for a moment, frozen, staring at each other. Then she pulled harder, and something gave way. A soft thud. Rebecca looked down. On the floor between them was something she couldn't immediately process. A piece of molded silicone, flesh-toned, shaped like she couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. David's face went pale. He reached for it, tried to grab it, but Rebecca stepped back, her hand over her mouth. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the truth. This wasn't a scar. This wasn't a medical condition. This was a lie. A massive, incomprehensible lie. She asked him what it was, her voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen, his eyes wide, his hands trembling. Rebecca felt something crack inside her. All the love, all the trust, all the dreams she'd built around this man shattered in an instant. She screamed at him. "Who are you? What are you?" He tried to speak, tried to explain, but the words that came out were broken, incoherent. He said it wasn't what she thought, that he could explain, that he loved her. But Rebecca wasn't listening anymore. She felt a rage she'd never experienced before, a fury so intense it drowned out everything else. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp on the bedside table. She swung, hard. The sound of glass shattering filled the room. David stumbled back, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. He raised his hands, pleading with her to stop, but she couldn't. She didn't. She swung again, and again. Neighbors later said they heard screaming that night, the kind that made them freeze, that made their blood run cold. One called the police. When officers arrived, they found Rebecca sitting on the front porch, her hands covered in blood, her face blank. Inside, they found David on the bedroom floor, barely conscious, his face swollen, his body battered. If you're still watching, drop a comment with "I'm still here," so we know who's riding this case out with us. The scene was chaos. Paramedics rushed in, working quickly to stabilize David, whose real name they would soon discover was not David at all. Rebecca was led away in handcuffs, still silent, still in shock. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. She just stared straight ahead as they put her in the back of the police car. By morning, the story had spread through the small town like wildfire. Neighbors gathered in clusters on the street, whispering, speculating. How could sweet Rebecca, the quiet librarian who baked cookies for the neighborhood kids, have done something so violent? Local news vans parked outside her house, reporters delivering breathless updates. The headlines were sensational. Florida woman attacks husband after shocking bedroom discovery. Police initially treated it as a domestic violence case, but as they dug deeper, they realized this was far more complicated than a simple assault. Detectives started asking questions. Who was this man? They ran his fingerprints. Nothing came up. His ID, his social security number, everything was fake. His name wasn't David Crawford. They didn't know what his real name was. When they searched the house, they found a storage bin in the garage, hidden behind boxes of holiday decorations. Inside were more prosthetics, fake IDs with different names, wigs, even padded clothing. This man had been living a lie, not just with Rebecca, but likely with others. Investigators began reaching out to other towns, other states, looking for similar reports. What they found was disturbing. Rebecca, meanwhile, sat in a holding cell, her mind unable to process what had happened. She kept replaying that moment, the prosthetic falling to the floor, the look on his face, the rage that consumed her. She'd never been a violent person. She'd never even been in a fight. But in that moment, she'd felt capable of anything. Detectives questioned her for hours. She told them everything, the way they met, the relationship, the small red flags she'd ignored, the moment of discovery. She cried as she spoke, her voice breaking. She kept saying she didn't understand. How could she have lived with him for over a year and not known? The lead detective, a woman named Sandra Martinez, saw something in Rebecca that others might have missed. This wasn't a woman who planned violence. This was a woman who'd been shattered by betrayal, who'd acted in a moment of pure shock and rage. But that didn't change the fact that she'd seriously injured someone. The question became, what would prosecutors charge her with? Attempted murder? Aggravated assault? Self-defense was off the table. He hadn't attacked her. But her lawyers would later argue something else. Extreme emotional disturbance. They claimed that the discovery, the sudden, brutal revelation of such a massive deception, had caused a psychological break, a temporary insanity that made her incapable of controlling her actions. The case became a media sensation. Talk shows debated it. Online forums exploded with opinions. Some people sympathized with Rebecca, saying they would have reacted the same way. Others condemned her, saying violence was never the answer. But everyone had the same question. What was this man hiding that was worth creating an entire fake identity? And that's when investigators found the first real clue. They tracked down a woman in Jacksonville, about 2 hours north. Her name was Patricia. She'd filed a restraining order against a man matching David's description 2 years earlier. When detectives showed her photos, she confirmed it was him, though he'd used a different name with her. Marcus. Patricia's story was eerily similar. He'd swept her off her feet, moved in quickly, kept his body hidden, always made excuses. But Patricia had started asking too many questions. One night she'd found fake documents in his car, passports with different names, all with his photo. When she confronted him, he'd disappeared. Just packed up and left in the middle of the night. She never saw him again. Patricia told detectives she'd reported it to police, but without evidence of a crime, there was nothing they could do. Now, armed with this new information, investigators realized they were dealing with a serial deceiver, possibly even a con man. They dug deeper, contacting police departments across Florida, then expanding to neighboring states. What they uncovered was staggering. At least 7 other women had reported relationships with a man matching his description over the past decade. Each time he used a different name, a different backstory. Sometimes he claimed to be a widower, other times divorced. Once he said he was a veteran with PTSD. But the pattern was always the same. He'd find vulnerable women, usually middle-aged, recently divorced or widowed, women looking for companionship. He'd charm them, move in quickly, then keep them at arm's length physically. Most relationships ended when the women started asking questions. A few, like Rebecca, discovered the truth by accident. None had reacted as violently as Rebecca, but then again, none had felt as betrayed. Rebecca's lawyer, a sharp public defender named Marcus Chen, began building her defense around this. His client wasn't a criminal. She was a victim of prolonged psychological manipulation and abuse. The fake identity, the lies, the constant deception, it had all been a form of emotional torture, and when the truth finally came out, her mind couldn't handle it. She snapped. The trial began 6 months later. The courthouse in Tampa was packed every day. Media outlets from across the country sent reporters. Court TV broadcast the proceedings live. People were fascinated by the case, not just because of the violence, but because of the central mystery. Who was this man, and why did he do it? On the first day of trial, prosecutors laid out their case. Rebecca Mitchell had brutally assaulted a man in her home, causing severe injuries including a fractured skull, broken ribs, and permanent damage to his left eye. They showed photos of his injuries, graphic images that made several jurors wince. They argued that while the defendant had been deceived, that didn't give her the right to nearly beat a man to death. The defense countered by calling expert witnesses. Psychologists testified about the effects of prolonged deception on mental health, how it could cause dissociative episodes, temporary breaks from reality. They explained that Rebecca's actions weren't premeditated or calculated. They were the result of acute psychological trauma. But the real bombshell came on day 4 of the trial. The defense called a surprise witness, a forensic genealogist named Dr. Ellen Briggs. She'd been hired by the defense to finally uncover the true identity of the man Rebecca knew as David. Using DNA evidence collected from the crime scene, Dr. Briggs had traced his family tree, working backward through genetic markers and public records. And what she found was shocking. The man's real name was Thomas Eugene Barrett. He was 58 years old, born in rural Georgia, and he'd been living as a woman for the first 35 years of his life. The courtroom erupted, gasps, whispers, several people standing up. The judge called for order, pounding her gavel repeatedly. Dr. Briggs continued, her voice steady and professional. Thomas had been born biologically female, raised as a girl in a deeply religious, conservative family. But from a young age, he'd known something was different. He didn't feel like a girl. He felt like a boy trapped in the wrong body. In his early 30s, Thomas had left his small town and started living as a man. He'd taken hormones, had top surgery, changed his name legally, but he'd never had bottom surgery. He couldn't afford it, and later, medical complications made it impossible. So he'd learned to hide. He'd become an expert at concealment, using prosthetics, always keeping his body covered, avoiding intimate situations. And when relationships inevitably reached a point where the truth might come out, he'd disappear and start over somewhere else. The revelation changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just a story about deception. It was a story about identity, about survival, about a man so desperate to live as his true self that he'd constructed an elaborate web of lies. Some people in the courtroom felt sympathy for Thomas. Others felt he'd crossed a line, that his need for secrecy didn't justify deceiving women into relationships. Rebecca, sitting at the defense table, looked stunned. She'd spent months trying to understand why he'd lied to her. Now she knew. And somehow, that made it worse. Because it wasn't about her. It had never been about her. She was just another person in a long line of people Thomas had used to validate his identity, to feel normal, to feel seen. But he'd never trusted her enough to tell her the truth. He'd never given her the chance to love him as he truly was. Do you think this was pure deception, or something darker? Do you think Thomas was wrong to hide his identity, or was he just trying to survive in a world that wouldn't accept him? Type yes. If you think he was wrong, no, if you understand why he did it. I want to know what you think, because this question divided not just the courtroom, but the entire country. Rebecca's lawyer used this revelation to strengthen his case. He argued that his client had been denied the fundamental right to informed consent. She'd entered into a relationship believing she knew who her partner was, only to discover that nearly everything had been a lie. That kind of betrayal, he argued, would break anyone. The prosecution countered that Thomas's identity didn't excuse violence, that no matter what had been hidden, Rebecca had still made a choice to pick up that lamp and swing it, that she could have walked away, could have ended the relationship, could have done literally anything other than assault him. The jury was out for 3 days. During that time, Rebecca sat in her cell, unable to eat, unable to sleep. She kept thinking about Thomas, about the man she'd loved, the man she'd thought she knew. She wondered if any of it had been real. Had he loved her at all? Or was she just a convenient cover, a way for him to play house and pretend he was someone he wasn't? The answer to that question came in the form of a letter delivered to her lawyer on the 3rd day of deliberations. It was from Thomas, written from his hospital bed. He'd undergone multiple surgeries and was recovering slowly, but he'd insisted on writing to her. The letter was 5 pages long, handwritten, smudged in places where tears had fallen. In it, Thomas apologized. He told Rebecca that he had loved her, that she'd made him feel more like himself than he'd felt in years. He explained his past, his struggles, his fear of rejection. He said he'd wanted to tell her the truth 1,000 times, but every time he tried, the words caught in his throat. He was terrified she'd leave, terrified she'd look at him with disgust. So he'd said nothing, and that silence had destroyed them both. At the end of the letter, he wrote something that would haunt Rebecca for the rest of her life. I don't blame you for what you did. I blame myself. I should have trusted you with the truth. I hope someday you can forgive me. Rebecca read the letter in her cell, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know if she could forgive him, but she understood him, and that understanding brought a different kind of pain. On the 4th day, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood. Guilty, but not of attempted murder. The jury had convicted Rebecca of aggravated assault, but they'd also included a recommendation for leniency. Several jurors later spoke to the press, explaining that they believed Rebecca had been severely wronged, but that violence couldn't be excused. It was a compromise verdict, one that reflected the complexity of the case. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Holbrook, took 2 weeks to consider sentencing. During that time, she received hundreds of letters from people across the country, some begging for mercy, others demanding justice. When the sentencing hearing finally came, Judge Holbrook spoke for nearly 20 minutes before announcing her decision. She acknowledged the pain Rebecca had suffered, the betrayal, the shock. But she also emphasized that the law existed to prevent people from taking justice into their own hands, no matter how justified they felt. She sentenced Rebecca to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3. It was a lighter sentence than many expected, but it was still devastating. Rebecca's sister sobbed in the gallery. Her friends from church held each other, crying. Rebecca herself stood stoic, her face unreadable. As she was led away, she glanced back one last time, her eyes finding Thomas in the back of the courtroom. He was in a wheelchair, his face still bruised, one eye covered with a patch. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. In that moment, there was no anger, no hatred, just a profound, overwhelming sadness. 2 people who'd loved each other, or at least thought they had, destroyed by secrets and lies. But the story didn't end there. 3 months into Rebecca's sentence, something unexpected happened. Thomas reached out to her lawyer, requesting a meeting. Rebecca agreed, curious and cautious. They met in the prison visiting room, separated by glass, communicating through phones. It was the first time they'd spoken since that night. Thomas looked different, older, more worn, but his eyes were the same. He told Rebecca that he was leaving Florida, moving to California where he had a cousin. He said he was done hiding, done lying. He was going to live openly as who he was, and if people didn't accept him, that was their problem. Rebecca listened, her hand pressed against the glass. She asked him why he'd come. Thomas hesitated, then said he needed her to know something, that their relationship, despite how it ended, had been the realest thing he'd experienced in decades, that loving her had made him want to be honest, even if he'd failed. He said he was sorry, truly sorry, and that he didn't expect forgiveness. He just wanted her to know the truth. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Then she told him something that surprised even herself. She said she forgave him, not because what he did was okay, but because she understood now that his lies weren't about her. They were about his survival, his fear, his deep, desperate need to be seen as he truly was. She said she wished he'd trusted her enough to tell her, that she would have tried to understand. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. He said he wished he had too. They talked for an hour, 2 broken people trying to make sense of the wreckage between them. When the time was up, Thomas stood to leave. He pressed his hand against the glass. Rebecca did the same. They stayed like that for a moment, a silent goodbye. Then he turned and walked away. Rebecca never saw him again. But she heard, through her lawyer, that he'd settled in San Francisco, that he was living openly, that he'd started volunteering at an LGBTQ center, helping others navigate their transitions. In a strange way, their story had set him free. Rebecca served 3 years before being granted parole. When she was released, she moved in with her sister, far from the town where everything had happened. She got a job at a small bookstore, kept to herself. She didn't date. She didn't trust easily. But slowly, carefully, she began to rebuild her life. She went to therapy, worked through the trauma, learned to separate the man she loved from the lies he told. And eventually, she found a kind of peace. Not happiness, exactly, but acceptance. An understanding that life is complicated, that people are complicated, and that sometimes love isn't enough to bridge the gap between 2 people's truths. Years later, a journalist contacted Rebecca, asking if she'd be willing to share her story for a documentary. Rebecca thought about it for a long time. Then she agreed, on one condition: That the story be told honestly, without judgment, acknowledging both the pain she'd suffered and the pain Thomas had lived with his entire life. The documentary aired 2 years later. It sparked conversations across the country about identity, consent, trauma, and forgiveness. Some people praised Rebecca for her courage, others criticized her for the violence, but most people just watched and wondered what they would have done in her position. Before I reveal the final shocking detail, hit that like button if this story has already left you stunned, because what I'm about to tell you changes everything you thought you knew about this case. 6 months after the documentary aired, Rebecca received a package. Inside was a letter and a small wooden box. The letter was from Thomas's cousin. It explained that Thomas had passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months earlier. He'd had a heart condition, one he'd been managing for years. In his will, he'd left Rebecca one thing: the quilt, the one he'd bought at the charity auction the day they met. The cousin explained that Thomas had kept it all these years, that he'd told her it reminded him of the last time he'd felt truly hopeful about love. Rebecca opened the box. Inside, carefully folded, was the quilt, and tucked into the center was a small note in Thomas's handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me, even if only for a moment." Rebecca sat on her porch that evening, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders, and for the first time since that terrible night, she allowed herself to cry, not from anger or pain, but from grief, for the man she'd loved, for the life they could have had, for all the what-ifs that would never be answered. So what do we take from this? What lesson is buried in the wreckage of Rebecca and Thomas's story? Maybe it's that deception, no matter how well-intentioned, always has a cost, that secrets corrode trust, and trust is the foundation of every relationship. Or maybe it's that we're all just trying to survive in a world that often doesn't make space for who we truly are. That sometimes people lie not because they want to hurt us, but because they're terrified of being hurt themselves. Rebecca served her time. She faced the consequences of her actions, but she also found a way to forgive, not just Thomas, but herself, because holding on to rage and pain would have destroyed her just as surely as the violence had destroyed their relationship. In the end, love wasn't what destroyed her life. It was the lies. But it was also love, or at least the memory of it, that helped her find her way back. What's your take on this? Was justice truly served? Do you think Rebecca's sentence was fair, or should it have been more severe or less? Do you think Thomas was wrong to hide his identity, or do you understand why he felt he had no other choice? And here's the big one. If you were in Rebecca's position, if you discovered something that fundamentally changed everything you thought you knew about the person you loved, how would you react? Would you walk away? Would you try to understand? Or would you, like Rebecca, feel that surge of rage that makes you lose control? Comment below. I'm reading every single one. I want to know what you think, because stories like this don't have easy answers. They challenge us to think about empathy, about judgment, about the line between victim and perpetrator. And if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear what happened in our next case. A woman who discovered her husband wasn't just hiding one secret, but running an entire second life, complete with another family. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. Hit that notification bell, and if this story moved you, share it. Because sometimes the most important conversations start with the most uncomfortable truths. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. I'll see you in the next one.